People think topsoil is just dirt, and it is not. Okay, there's a difference between soil and dirt. Right? Yes, they're both ground, but they are not the same. Okay, you cannot grow a plant in dirt. You can grow a plant in soil, but you can grow a plant in dirt if you spray nitrogen on it, fixed nitrogen, okay, in the form of ammonium nitrate, fertilizer. If and add a few extra things like Miracle Grow. Okay, so you can take dirt and make it productive by throwing Miracle Grow on it. That's true. You can do that. The question is the plant that grows in soil the same as the plant that grows in dirt with Miracle Grow? That's the question. And the answer is no, it's not. All right. We think it is. Okay. The food industry acts like it is, but it's not.
We talked last time about big everything. We went deeper into big sugar, but there's also, when we talk about metabolic health is very much this upstream concept in health and wellness, where you think of all the downstream implications that happen. Well, what's further upstream in the food system, or like the furthest upstream, is this idea of getting into production. And when we think about companies that are involved at the production, not food processing, but more in agriculture, you look at them and you go, BASF, Bayer, DuPont. And you're like, I'm pretty sure those are chemical companies, or they make, right? They're companies that are non-traditional when you think of agriculture and you have a heuristic of John Deere. So thought it would be good to go into this idea of how some products get into the food production system to begin with, or some things like insecticides, and then take it from there.
Understood. Ultimately, there are the growers and then there are the helpers, as it were, the helpers to grow. And the growers, we actually don't know their names. They're very much, small groups for the most part. It's the helpers of the growers that are, sort of the interesting ones because, they've got specific products that end up being incorporated into our food that we don't necessarily know because, after all, there's no logo on the front. And the reason there's no logo on the front is because all of the things have been, quote, generally recognized as safe by the government. So we, quote, don't need to know, as it were. And that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of this. Um, we're not talking about, you know, um, mom and pop farms. We're not even talking about, um, uh, International Harvester or John Deere, that help produce the food through, through cultivation. We're talking about, the groups of companies that add something or subtract something, and those companies are known to us, as, quote, sort of chemical companies for the most part. We're talking about Monsanto. We're talking about BASF, as you said. We're talking about Bayer, who bought Monsanto. We're talking about Syngenta in Europe. These are companies that make products that then either are used to change the food in some fashion or to prevent its degradation. And when we say prevent degradation, we're usually talking about either herbicides or pesticides. Now, to some extent, we've been able to increase productivity in the food system because we've had decreased loss. The locusts don't, kill off the wheat fields anymore. All right. And, that, I guess, in one way is good because you can feed a lot more people and you can feed a lot more people cheaply when you don't have, uh, uh, a problem with either wastage or what's the word I'm looking for?
Spoilage, I guess.
Yeah, spoilage or destruction of crops. So, that has contributed to the U.S. being the behemoth in food production that we've become. You could make an argument that that's a good thing, and from an economic standpoint, I would guess that that's true. The question, what's the downside of that? Well, let's talk about the downside of that. It starts actually in World War II. It starts with the fact that we had a problem with typhus and we had a problem with malaria, and we were losing troops, to these, terrible infectious diseases in the field. And so we had to basically clear, the large swaths of land from vegetation. And, back in the 1920s, I believe it was. I think it was actually produced first in 1879, but in the 1920s, this new product called DDT came along. And in 1939, it started being applied to World War II vegetation to try to help the American soldier. And it was very effective in keeping the typhus uh, and uh, uh, problem down significantly during World War II. I mean, World War One, we didn't have it, and it was a huge issue. World War II, we had other issues, but that wasn't one of them. The fact of the matter is, that led after the war to DDT starting to be used for getting rid of vegetation, as an insecticide virtually everywhere. And in fact, the guy who brought DDT to the war, Paul Hermann Mueller, won the Nobel Prize in 1948 for the application of DDT to this. So obviously somebody thought this was something good if you win a Nobel Prize for it. Well, it had its downside. And it wasn't until 1962 that we even realized there was a downside. And so this stuff was basically sprayed willy-nilly over, the entire, cropland of the United States in an attempt to try to reduce spoilage. Well, then Rachel Carson came along and said, this is causing a problem. And, it was causing a problem in terms of cancer. It's caused a problem in terms of fertility. It's caused a problem because DDT is an estrogen. Okay. And it doesn't take much to be an estrogen. All it takes is two hydroxyl groups 22 angstroms apart. There are a lot of compounds in our environment that are estrogens. There are a lot of compounds that are made by chemical companies that are estrogens. BPA, bisphenol A, which is used on the inside of packaging, to keep cans from spoiling. As an example, and it's in the thermal paper at Target, that we print our receipts on. So these compounds are almost everywhere, and so she was the first one to associate DDT with increased cancer risk and also changes in fertility. We know that fertility is going down in humans. It's also going down in animals all over the planet. We've got an alligator problem. Not too many alligators. We've got too few alligators. The entire, Everglades actually, may lose its entire alligator population, and it's because of DDT. Because you can actually measure the DDE levels in the alligators, and fact is that DDT went away from the United States. I mean, we banned it finally in 1972, but you can measure its metabolite today in the alligators, and you can also measure it in pregnant women's urine in the Salinas Valley, which we did. I'm a member of an academic group out of UC Berkeley that studies a cohort in the Salinas Valley, uh, Steinbeck country, called Chamacos, and it's the children and mothers of Salinas. So it's the assessing the health of these offspring of women who were exposed to all of these insecticides, pesticides early on in their pregnancy, and what effects this might have long term. And we can see the effects on cognition, we can see the effects on reproduction, we can see the effects on obesity, we can see the effects on puberty, because these compounds are estrogens. Estrogens make really good insecticides because they interfere with the life cycle of the insect. Yeah, but they are poisoning us too. So we learned that. We learned it the hard way. The question is, did we learn it? Well, we learned it about DDT. We didn't learn about anything else, because right on the heels of DDT being banned, then everyone said, "Well, what are we going to do next? How are we going to fix the spoilage problem? On the next round." Well, and then Monsanto, came up with, shall we say, the next big thing, and that was glyphosate. And glyphosate has a really, really sordid, history associated with it. And we are really just uncovering, we're just pulling back the band-aid on the wound of glyphosate, even just now. And so this is continues to be an enormous problem. And it's not just glyphosate. If it were just glyphosate, that would be bad enough. But we've got another one called atrazine. Okay, and that one, Bucktrill, and that one was created by Syngenta, and they both Monsanto and Syngenta, claimed on a stack of Bibles that this stuff was safe. Yeah, but they've been paying out court cases, for cancer, in both here and in Europe. Uh, uh, Not admitting wrongdoing, by the way. They're all settled, except for the case in 2018, where a gardener at a school ended up suing for his lymphoma, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and won $280 million. So that sort of got Monsanto's attention. Actually, Bayer ended up buying Monsanto, and we can talk about the whys and wherefores of why they would have done that. But they've now created a fund where they have put $10 billion into glyphosate uh, uh, class action lawsuits. So if that's the case, how did these compounds get on the market in the first place? And the answer is because nobody did the studies. That's how.
Hmm. And that's something you alluded to in metabolical and in this conversation, the grass list, where some of these some of these chemicals or compounds, things, these obesogens that make it into food production in some way, shape, or form, just sort of make it onto the grass list, and there isn't really any diligence, and then they're there and they're just accepted as safe. So we have let's go back to, so 72 is when DDT was banned, and around the corner from that, 1974, our good friends Monsanto, and by good friends I mean it colloquially, Monsanto comes out with Roundup, 1974, and that ended up being this pesticide that, or herbicide I should say, that ended up leading to super weeds, leading to all of these problems. And we'll see from what you're seeing right now with your research and obesogens, how long it takes for something like DDT to actually get out of the system. It's there, and we don't know with Roundup how long this will last. But fast forward to 96, when we started to have Roundup Ready, right? And they had soybeans, and that's a whole different issue as far as seed saving and pushing monoculture on farmers, and like we can touch on that, but it's more the importance of things take a really long time to get out of the system, and we know that there was collusion and corruption with some of the awareness that Monsanto had internally towards the health implications of this product, but they kept pushing it out to market. And so that has led to some very serious considerations for even now what we're seeing with topsoil, where people go, our topsoil is kind of dying, and we should think about regenerative farming. Like, there are so many issues aside from
Right.
health.
So what you're absolutely right. People think topsoil is just dirt, and it is not. Okay. There's a difference between soil and dirt. Right. Yes, they're both ground, but they are not the same. Okay. You cannot grow a plant in dirt. You can grow a plant in soil, but you can grow a plant in dirt if you spray nitrogen on it, fixed nitrogen, okay, in the form of ammonium nitrate, fertilizer. If it, and add a few extra, things like Miracle Grow. Okay, so you can take dirt and make it productive by throwing Miracle Grow on it. That's true. You can do that. The question is the plant that grows in soil the same as the plant that grows in dirt with Miracle Grow? That's the question. And the answer is no, it's not. All right. We think it is. Okay. The food industry acts like it is, but it's not. Right. And the reason is because soil is alive. Soil has bacteria, viruses, fungi, mushrooms, fungi that make stuff, okay, and actually contribute to the vitality of that um, of that soil that allow for the plants that grow to be able to create the uh, uh, various chemicals that they need for their survival, that they need for their defense against, you know, locusts and you know ticks and we boll weevils and what have you also, uh, in order to fend off foreign invaders and also to create the various nutritive compounds that basically help us, which we call vitamins or flavonoids or various things. So bottom line is we get all of these essential nutrients from primarily plants. That's why plants are important. And, we need those uh, um, uh, chemicals. Okay. They are essential. We can't make them, we have to consume them. And they're basically made by what's in the soil. Well, yeah, but the dirt doesn't have that. Okay, the dirt doesn't have all of those things. What it does is it sprays the various chemicals that the plant ultimately needs, but it doesn't actually then produce the things that we want that plant to produce. So that plant is essentially nutritionally deficient because it didn't have what it needed to create the chemicals it required for its survival. So you know, bottom line is, uh, processed plant production is not the same as regenerative farming, where you're basically growing stuff in soil that works. So this is, part of the problem. It means that, our current processed plant production in the United States is deficient. It's deficient nutritionally, and it's unbelievably uh, 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 problematic in terms of climate change. So let's talk about climate change real quick because we have many other things to talk about. But climate change is due to greenhouse gases entering the atmosphere. No argument. The question is, where are those greenhouse gases coming from? The overwhelming majority is coming from industrial petroleum use rather than from agriculture. But agriculture definitely provides a proportion, and it depends on who you read as to what that proportion is. So I've seen levels as low as 14%. I've seen levels as high as 33%, depending on who you read and depending on exactly what they are calling, the use. Because some of them just talk about the uh, agriculture itself. Some of them are talking about the animals only. Some of them are talking about the plants only. Some of them add the transporting, into the equation as well. So, there are different numbers as to what percent of climate change is due to agriculture. I don't want to go there. That's for the statisticians and for people who do spreadsheets better than I do. Here's what I want to say. Everyone blames the cows. Everyone is saying cows make methane, and methane contributes to climate change. Well, methane does contribute to climate change. I'm not arguing that. That is true. The question is, where's the methane coming from? And it turns out that most of the methane is actually still coming from petroleum, not from cows. Yes, cows do make methane. It's true. Cows have always made methane. Okay, all you have to do is go to a cow farm, and you'll know pretty quick that cows make methane. It's true, they do. The question is how much. In 1968, there were more cows in the United States than there are today because of changes in meat consumption and changes in current food processing. There are actually more head of cattle than there are now by 20%. Yet the entire cow um, mass, if you will, the entire herd of cows in the United States produced a total of 14 teragrams of um, methane per year. Now that's a lot of methane. I'm not arguing. Okay, a teragram is a Golden Gate Bridge. All right, that's the so 14 Golden Gate bridges. Right, but today there are fewer heads of cattle, but those cattle are producing 74 teragrams of methane, 74 Golden Gate bridges. So they are actually producing 6 times the amount of methane per cow than they were back in 1968. So it is true that the cows are making the methane. The question is, how come they're making so much more methane today than they were back then? And if we got rid of those, that 6 times amount, okay, could we actually make a difference? And the answer is yes, we could. So then why are they making 6 times the amount? And the answer to that is antibiotics. We are injecting all of those cattle with antibiotics. And the reason we're doing that is because these cows back in 1968, they were basically they were being raised on farms. Okay. And the farms had alfalfa, and the farms had clover, and the farms had grass. And that's what these cows ate. Okay. And they got the essential nutrients that they needed in order to stave off infection from the various and sundry plant products that they were that was available to them on the farm. Well, today those cows are not on the farm. They've been moved. They've been moved to something called a CAFO, CAFO, Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. They're all throughout Nebraska and Kansas and Oklahoma. Okay, that's where these CAFOs are. And these CAFOs basically, and you've seen pictures of them. There's no place for the cow to roam. There's no place for the cow to obtain food other than what is provided to them by the ranchers, and that happens to be corn that's shipped in from Iowa. All right, and the reason that this happened was because back in 1971, Earl Butz basically said we have to make food cheap, and in order to do that, we have to create monoculture because that economies of scale, and that's ultimately what changed the farm culture in America. And so we moved the cows to Kansas, we moved all the corn to Iowa, so now there's no manure to carbon fix the soil in Iowa. So you have to spray the ammonium nitrate in which creates nitrous oxide, which is way more heat trapping than methane ever was. All right, and you've got all the cows in the on the CAFOs who have to receive the antibiotics because they're not getting the essential nutrients they need in order to maintain their ability to stave off infection. And so what that's done is those antibiotics have basically killed the cow's intestine. And so what moves in instead? Nature abhors a vacuum. So the methanogens, which are resistant to those antibiotics, they've moved in. And that's why the cows are making 6 times the amount of methane because the methanogens have taken over. Could we fix that? Could we undo that? And the answer is if the cows ate what was on the farm, yeah. Well, how are you going to do that? Put them back on the farm. Well, that's regenerative farming. That's what we're talking about. Okay, where we carbon fix the old way, the right way, the way that made sense for thousands of years, since the advent of the concept of agriculture, and undo this, food processing that's gone on. So, yes, it is the insecticides, but it's also, the method of food production that we have undertaken in the United States.
Hmm. Yeah, so you talk about that lots where it's the let's play both sides of it. There's a principal agent problem because, in one sense, so Earl Butz is involved in instilling these incentives for monoculture, and we focus on quantity, quantity, quantity. And like there's food. We're just going to call this like categorically food. Whether or not it is nutritious, we will leave that out. But categorically, there's this thing called food, and there's a whole bunch of it. And so everyone can sort of check a box and be like, we've done well. But then the long term implications are, well, you're taking away all the symbiosis you get in this ecosystem of having multiple types of plants all living together, animals grazing on that land, cattle putting carbon back into the soil to get all of the organisms and to get all the bacteria growing where you have a healthy ecosystem. And so monoculture produced a ton of quantity. Amazing. Like cool, we fed a bunch of people, but the downside is the quality went down so much that the health implications from this food, this category, we're now seeing the effects of it years and years later, and it's not something that is as easy to fix because people say, well, we would love to get back into regenerative farming, but it's too hard, or it's like everything becomes excuses. And so then we just keep focusing and going down the path of monoculture, and we're really seeing it's got detrimental effects to the food production system.
I don't look, you're not old enough to remember this, Ben. Okay, but I am, unfortunately. But I remember this. Okay, once upon a time, we paid farmers not to grow certain crops. Okay, and we did it for two reasons. One reason was because we didn't want to glut, because that maintained higher prices when there was lower availability. And the second reason was because that allowed farmers to take some of their land to lie fallow so that the soil could be regenerated. Okay, so that you could end up with an improved topsoil layer. Right? That's how we managed farming back in the 1960s. And it worked, except food prices were high. And they were artificially high to some extent. Right? And they were also high because we were starting to subsidize corn, wheat, soy, sugar, which meant that all the other items basically were taxed, because if you're subsidizing something, that means you got to tax everything else in order to make book. All right. So we already had a problem in terms of, where the money was being allocated. All right. But in 1971, Richard Nixon, in his infinite wisdom, and I put that in quotes, um, colloquially, as you put it, he realized that fluctuating food prices cause political unrest. And he had a whole lot of political unrest to deal with, as you might remember. And so, make food cheap, became his, watchword and his contribution to Johnson's war on poverty. And it was, during the Nixon years that we developed WIC. It was then during the Nixon years that, the National School Lunch Program, expanded. Didn't start, but it's expanded. The goal was put something in people's bellies because that was better than starvation, and anything counted. And the question is, was that a good idea? Well, the whole country thought it was a good idea until it wasn't. And now, we're basically paying for the downside of that, alteration in policy. The farmers today, the ones that are still around, will say this was a great policy because they're still around. You know how many small farmers got knocked out of the out of the box because of it? Because it was all about monoculture and only the big guys could play. And that's what Earl Butz said was, um, row to row, furrow to furrow, get bigger, get out. So this worked for a select few farmers, and that's why there are very few private farms now in America's heartland. They've all gone, they've all gone away, and in the process, we've turned soil into dirt. And what the only way to make it productive is to spray nitrogen fertilizer on it, and now you've got the whole vicious cycle going. So how do you fix that? How do you fix that? And the answer is you have to make food better. And you can't make food better in dirt.
Yeah, and that's the principal agent problem and all the moral hazard that comes with this is multi-tiered. So in one sense, there are the we'll say the producers. A lot of the producers don't own their land. So their incentive is to just produce. They're not incentivized to actually like take care of the land because hypothetically, let's just use an example. Assume that switching costs are easy. Like you can just like get up and transplant your food production to another piece of land. Assume it was easy. They are not incentivized because they're not vertically integrated. They're not incentivized to actually do anything or to take care of the land. So that's one consideration for principal agent. And then the other is when we start to think about the incentives from subsidies perspective, from a monoculture perspective, principal agent having to do with the downstream consumer. The producer is incentivized to focus on profits over environment, profits over uh, doing right for long-term health, like profits over, and it just keeps going. And so then you get back into these things, and we've talked about some of the internal collusion that happens either between these companies or between independent agents that are acting sort of between different parts of the process, and it leads to a lot of complications. We're realizing now, but you put it so well in metabolical where if we went upstream in food production, it's a fraction to like, I don't wanna say fix because you can't just snap your fingers and fix, but to address, it's a fraction of the cost of everything that we pay in the healthcare system right now.
That's right. Ultimately, people see these as two separate silos. They see agriculture as one silo. They see health as a completely separate silo. They are not. Okay. They are two subsets, of one silo. And if you combine those two silos together on a spreadsheet, you would recognize that the current attempts to try to uh, rob Peter at the agricultural level, okay, we're paying Paul at the healthcare level, okay, and the farmers, are not interested in the healthcare side. The healthcare side is not interested in the agricultural side. They don't even understand how food ultimately impacts health. They only know that lack of food impacts health. They don't see that the food has become toxic. So that's the question I actually posed to the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is part of the WHO, part of the UN, uh, Jose Gonzalez de Silva, back in 2017 at a meeting. I said, which is better? Sorry, which is worse? Which is worse? Neither is better, but which is worse? No food or bad food? And he didn't have an answer. And that's right. He didn't have an answer. You know, the obvious answer would be no food, because no food starts wars, right? Well, wars have an end, right? And then the no food stops being a problem. And I'm not saying that we should all go to war. What I'm saying is bad food, the problem is insidious. It's like frog boil, you don't know what's happening. And so things, terrible things start happening, and you don't even realize that that's the reason for it. And ultimately, it ends up costing way more in terms of lives and in terms of uh, economy, and in terms of healthcare expenditures, and it's breaking the bank on virtually every developed and developing country now, taking care of chronic metabolic disease that came because of our lousy food. And then, of course, we have the social determinant of health. The fact of the matter is that rich people can afford the better food, and the poor people can't, and then so that's creating the social inequities that are actually tearing the country apart at the seams. So bad food might actually be worse.
Mhm. It's interesting too if we think about the macroeconomic considerations around a company being incentivized to make money on both sides. So let's use one example and we will I don't want to say try, we will remain as neutral as possible. But let's play out the scenario. So we're Bayer, we own Monsanto, and we're incentivized to grow a ton of food. But we're incentivized to make a ton of money in pharmaceuticals because we do both. We're incentivized to. I don't want to say that anyone is consciously trying to make people sick, but you know that the thing that you do that helps to get more people sick, you're making money on both ends. And so like you're kind of caught in this dilemma where the worse you can do in the food production system, and I'm speaking very hyperbolically about this, the better off you do in the pharmaceutical. So, like, you just want it all to happen because you're gonna, when you talk about profits, and like, let's take the rant one step further. You acquired a company, you inherited lawsuits in perpetuity in the billions of dollars. What do you do, right?
They must have thought that it was a good trade. They obviously, if they had thought that those billions of dollars were going to actually cut into their profits, they wouldn't have taken on the purchase of Monsanto, would they have? So obviously they analyzed this and decided, there was still more money to be made. And you're absolutely right. Bayer was a chemical company. Bayer was a, medicine company. It wasn't a food company, but now it's a food company. So you're right. Now they've got food and medicine. Well, guess what? There's another company that's food and medicine now too. Nestle. Nestle was always a food company. Well, now they're going into diabetes drugs. So what's the conflict of interest there? What's the conflict of interest for both of those? That's not moral hazard. That's immoral hazard because you're creating the market, to basically benefit off other people's misfortune.
And we've got DuPont as well. So DuPont, again, traditionally a chemical company playing in different parts of the food system, all of the issues with PFOA and Teflon, but in 2019 spun off a company called Corteva that is in the egg game, very much a seed company and seed and chemical, seed and fertilizer. But again, it's like having all of these subsidiary arms where you are traditionally a chemical company, or you're traditionally like you are not playing in the space, but you're getting involved in the space. This is where it gets to be very, very challenging. And as a consumer, as you said before, it's one of those things where we don't know. Like we can say eat real food all you want, but when you think you're doing well and you're eating real food and you don't realize that your food has things like pesticides in it, or and it's not all food, but it's very hard to get away from some of these considerations in the food system because it's so deeply ingrained.
Well, this isn't a new concept. The fact of the matter is the tobacco industry did this, back in the 1980s and 90s. You know, um, uh, Altria, is what Philip Morris morphed into, and they owned Kraft and General Foods, and RJR, Reynolds, owned Nabisco. They got into the food business. They were selling tobacco, but they were also selling food. Now, why was that? And the answer was because people started to stop smoking. Right. And the thing is, when you stop smoking, what do? You start eating because that addiction pathway is still lit up. Okay. And people will tell you, that's one of the reasons people continued to smoke was to keep their weight down. Right. And as soon as they stopped smoking, they started eating. So why wouldn't they want to be in on that? So this concept, the industry calls it diversification. But, you have to really look askance at, when a company is actually, basically playing both ends. And, there's definitely immoral hazard to be seen there.
Hmm. Yeah, it gets very challenging. So let's go into the idea of what can people do, right? Like we've highlighted that there are challenges, there are things that we do not see and will not know are happening within the food production system. There are some things that we can avoid, and there are some things that are a lot harder to avoid. So when thinking about giving people guidance or some goalposts for how they can think about accessing and eating real food. Like, we'll agree all day that, like, just don't eat Twinkies, don't eat things that are just like inherently bad. But when you think you're eating certain foods that, let's say, things like spinach that grow on the ground and would be the closest possible food to getting things like pesticides, right? It's a lot different than corn that comes in corn for what it is, but it still is comes in a wrapper, like it's wrapped up in leaves. So it's going to be uh there will be some mitigation against pesticides being directly hitting whether or not they're grown in fertilizers that are like in the actual vegetable is different. But what can people do? What are some takeaways they can have, or some way, maybe some frameworks, some heuristics they can have about thinking about real food and what they consume, and maybe questioning some of the things that I know you talk a lot about beef, where it's just like the thing that looks great on the shelf that tastes really good is actually full of omega 6 and probably not what we should be eating because of being corn fed.
All right. So the short answer, Ben, is the consumer is in the dark, and they're in the dark for many reasons. Okay. Because the food industry wants them to be in the dark. They don't want them to know what's going on. They don't want to actually have to list what's going on with the food. And unfortunately, the US government makes that easy for them because the food label, the nutrition facts label, is useless. And the reason is because the nutrition facts label tells you what's in the food. It doesn't tell you what's been done to the food. Does it say anywhere on a nutrition facts label the level of pesticides that are in that box or in that package or in that jar? No. Right? Would you like to know? I think so. I think people would like to know, but it's not listed. Why is it not listed? Because then nobody buy it. So, you know, so the government said we're not going to list those because that's not what's in the food. Actually, it is what's in the foods, but it's really but what's been done to the food. And that's key. All right. So this is part of the problem is that the government's made it very easy for the food industry to, shall we say, play three-card Monte with us, hide the ball. And, are there ways to fix that? Well, fixing the nutrition facts label would be a very good start, but then you'd basically have to tell people what's been done to the food. And that's not even on the table right now, even though that's what I say needs to happen. That's what I said in Metabolical is that, the call to, actually fix the food label so that consumers can be apprised properly. An example of this was what happened with Prop 65 here in California, which was basically all about GMOs. And, ultimately got voted down. And, that's because the food industry made this huge push, that basically, this was unnecessary. Well, it actually is necessary. But that's, that the food industry doesn't want to go there for obvious reasons. All right, what else can we do? Well, there are now organizations like, for instance, the Environmental Working Group, that are quantitating this for you. But, it's kind of hard to carry an environmental working group, thing, book practically in your back pocket. I mean, yes, it's online, but, you have to subscribe to it. You know, uh, a company that I am chief medical officer of called Perfect is trying to basically help people in the grocery store by, letting you basically get the barcode off the thing, and it will actually tell you not just what's in the food, because that you can read on the side, but what's been done to the food, so that there ultimately will be ways to do this. And ultimately, I'm working with a food procurement service called Fugal that will actually let you put in what you want, and with filters that basically will filter out all the stuff in the store that you don't want and only purchase the stuff you do. And actually, we're trying to get insurers to pay for that, because that will convey health rather than convey disease. And so, food as medicine, but unfortunately, food can also be poison. Well, the insurer doesn't want to pay for the poison. They only want to pay for the medicine. So, that has to be determined by an independent third party, which is what Fugal would be. So there are potential ways of doing it, but ultimately, you know, the consumer is in the dark. And, until consumers demand better, they will continue to be in the dark. And that's why education is so important, is ultimately not because you can affect one person at a time. That ain't going to work. Okay. What you have to do is affect one congressman at a time. All right. When we get enough congressmen on board, the problem, of course, is that 338 out of 535 congressmen today take money from the food industry to keep things exactly the way they are. And this is an organization called ALEC, or ALEC, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a bill mill that basically, is paid for by big oil, big pharma, and big ag. Big pharma. So, they want things to stay the same. All four of those, by the way, are guilty of immoral hazard. That's why they want things to stay the same. So this is shall we say, the um, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? This is the problem in our society today, is you know uh, the corporate environment that wants to basically make money off the backs of the electorate, and keep them in the dark, and keep them basically placated and narcotized, with lack of knowledge. And of course, that's what we're trying to fix right now.
So when people are there are certain principles people are grocery shopping. We talk about real food, that stay away from the aisles where something is highly, highly processed. Certain things that come in everything that comes in a package is I mean,
It is
almost all
processed.
food is processed in some way, because if the definition of processing is like taking it from the tree, taking
Yeah,
a
I mean,
apple from the tree, it's
yeah,
technically.
basically, unless you picked it yourself, it's processed. I mean, it goes that far. There's different levels of processing, to be sure. My colleague and good friend Carlos Montero, who is a professor of public health at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, has introduced and also now verified and validated an instrument that he calls the Nova system. And what it does is, instead of telling you what's in the food, it basically tells you the degree of processing of the food. And there are four classes of processing. And the best way to explain this would be with an apple. Okay. So, class one, according to Carlos, would be an apple. Class two would be apple slices in a package. Class three would be applesauce, sweetened applesauce. Class four would be an apple pie. Okay. They're all apples, but they're not. And they all contribute different levels of health versus disease, even though the prevailing ingredient is apples. In fact, by the time you get to apple pie, the prevailing ingredient is not apples. And that's the point. So when you start mixing ingredients, you get into ultra processing. And there are, ways to figure out what's what. And what he's shown with a set of very elegant epidemiologic studies in Europe, in now South America, now even in the United States, he has shown that the disease is in that class four. The amount of food you eat in that class four is what contributes to cardiac disease, diabetes, cancer, all-cause mortality. The other uh, classes one, two, and three, actually seem relatively devoid. Foods from those basically the same level as the general population. It's that class four, that ultra processed food category. But those are the foods that are marketed heavily. Those are the foods that have a logo. Those are the foods that have to be avoided. Those are the foods on the shelves, rather than in the crisper or refrigerator section of the supermarket. So, people say walk around the edge of the supermarket. Yeah, that's right. I mean, because the class four foods are shelf stable because they have been stripped of their fiber and they've had preservatives added. The primary one that of consequence is sugar, but all the other preservatives as well, including emulsifiers and um, uh, potassium bromate and all sort. I mean, whole BHA, BHT, etc. These are all on the shelves. They're not in the refrigerator sections of the supermarket.
Yeah, the class 4, that's where branding comes in. You're being marketed or sold to. So it's we know that it's very difficult from summarizing what we've talked about. It's very difficult to escape a lot of these obesogens. They're around us everywhere, and that's you and Casey had a great conversation about that. But when it comes to obesogens related to agriculture and upstream food production, it's very hard to avoid them. But if people can have a mental model that is eat more in this idea of class 1, it's completely different than going class 4. And so if you can start to make some of these choices, and then maybe the other thing is like if you see an apple the size of a basketball, like maybe question if that like question whether or not that is an apple you should consider eating, right? If you start to think about things like that.
Another thing you can do is look at color, like for tomatoes. Okay. Tomatoes, for instance, have a chemical in them called lycopene, which has gotten some notoriety because it's supposed to help vision, especially as you get older. All right. Well, only the red tomatoes have lycopene. The, shall we say, orangey tomatoes tend to be much larger. So people tend to like to buy those because they look, bigger, juicier, healthier. They're actually relatively devoid of lycopene. And, they've been bred out to be that way. In fact, a lot of the nutrients that we want out of our produce don't taste very good. The polyphenols, the flavonoids, the nucleic acids, et cetera, the choline, et cetera, they don't taste very good. They actually can provide some off notes. So a lot of the growers have actually bred various strains of different produce to be devoid of those, to have more sugar in them, to be sweeter, to actually hide those notes. And in the process, these become less nutritionally valuable. So there is that process going on as well. And that requires, unfortunately, a re-educated palate. And that's something that really does have to be done at an individual basis. There's no sort of government program to re-educate the palate, as it were. People just need to understand that, certain foods are supposed to taste a certain way. And if you've never tasted, a real tomato, you might not know that what a real tomato tastes like. And, you might opt for the crap, your entire life.
Brussels sprouts are meant to be bitter, not sweet.
Indeed.
So if you're eating Brussels sprouts that taste like raisins, you're probably on the wrong track.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's yet another layer of this, and that really does require some, shall we say, some intensive training on the part of each individual person on the planet. Good luck to us.